Rome, late 15th century. A city bathed in gold, marble, and incense, but also drowned in whispers of corruption, poison, and forbidden lust. In the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica, where the chants of priests echo across candlelit halls, one family rules with an iron fist disguised in velvet gloves, the Borgias. At the center of their dark legend stands a young woman whose beauty could captivate princes and condemn men to death, Lucrezia Borgia. Imagine a banquet at the Vatican. The hall glitters with crystal goblets, overflowing with ruby wine. The air is heavy with perfume, and laughter masks the tension of power. At the high table, beside the Pope himself, sits a golden-haired woman in a gown, woven with threads of silver. She lowers her eyes demurely. Her lips curve in a faint smile. To the untrained eye, she is merely a dutiful daughter, a symbol of elegance in a court of schemers. But the whispers tell another story. Some swear that the ring on her delicate finger conceals a deadly secret, a tiny chamber for poison, ready to slip into the chalice of an unsuspecting rival. Was it true? History offers no certainty, but legends are often more powerful than facts. And Lucrezia's legend would grow into something monstrous, something unforgettable. She was painted as both angel and demon, the innocent pawn of her father, Pope Alexander VI, and brother, Cesare Borgia, or the seductive assassin, the femme fatale of the Renaissance, whose gaze was said to be as dangerous as her beauty. Her name spread across Europe like wildfire. To some, she was the perfect bride, a prize to be fought over by dukes and kings. To others, she was the embodiment of corruption, the very rot at the heart of the Vatican. And as rumors piled upon rumors, incest, betrayal, poison, lust, Lucrezia became less of a woman and more of a myth drenched in blood and desire. But behind the myth was a real woman, a girl born into one of the most ruthless families in history, a pawn in their games of empire. Her life was not her own. From the moment she was old enough to smile, her beauty became a weapon. From the moment she was old enough to marry, her body became a bargaining chip. Love, loyalty, innocence, all of it was sacrificed to the dynasty. And yet, the legend of Lucrezia endures because it is more than gossip. It is the perfect Renaissance tragedy, a tale of power wrapped in silks, of poison poured into goblets, of whispered sins echoing in holy halls. A tale where the lines between victim and villain blur, until you can no longer tell whether she was the executioner or the condemned. This is not simply the story of a woman. This is the story of how history, honor, BAFTA, and rumor can create a monster out of beauty and a symbol out of scandal. Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of the Pope, sister of the most feared warlord in Italy, bride, widow, temptress, legend. To some, she was the Black Widow of Rome. To others, an innocent scapegoat crushed by the sins of her family. But to all, she remains unforgettable. And so, we step into her world, a world of poison, prophecy, and power. Lucrezia Borgia was born in 1480 in the Italian town of Subiaco, beneath the looming shadows of monasteries and fortresses that dotted the Roman countryside. From her first breath, she was destined to be more than just a child. She was a pawn in a family that was reshaping the destiny of Christendom itself. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, would soon become Pope Alexander II, a man who wielded the papacy not as a shepherd's crook, but as a weapon of dynastic ambition. To the world, she was a pope's daughter. To her family, she was leverage. Picture the world she grew up in. Rome at the dawn of the Renaissance, a city drenched in contradictions. The streets echoed with hymns of monks, yet just beyond the church doors lurked assassins and mercenaries. The Sistine Chapel ceiling had yet to be painted, but art flourished like wildfire, entwined with intrigue and sin. It was here, in this paradoxical cradle, that Lucrezia learned her first lessons, not of kindness, but of survival. From her earliest years, she was schooled by tutors who understood her true role. Her education was not simply about Latin declensions and courtly etiquette. It was about charm, manipulation, and the careful art of silence. She was taught to dance with grace, to play the lute with melancholy sweetness, to compose letters that could flatter kings or deceive enemies. But more importantly, she was taught to watch, to observe the whispers between cardinals, the glances exchanged by ambassadors, the silent nods that sealed conspiracies. The Borgia household itself was a labyrinth of contradictions. On one hand, Rodrigo lavished his children with luxury, silk gowns, jewels from Florence, feasts that could rival those of kings. But on the other hand, there was always a shadow, Cesare Borgia, her older brother, fierce, brilliant, and ruthless. Cesare was more than a sibling. He was the sword of the family. His charisma dazzled, but his ambition could burn through steel. For young Lucrezia, growing up under Cesare's watchful eye meant living in a world where love and fear blurred together. It is said that she was extraordinarily beautiful, even as a child. Golden hair that shimmered like sunlight, pale skin that seemed sculpted from marble, eyes that could shift from soft innocence to sharp calculation in a heartbeat. Artists who later painted her portrait swore she had the look of an angel, but with something deeper, something dangerous, lingering beneath the surface. Even at 12, she could silence a room simply by entering it. But beauty in the Borgia household was never innocent. It was a tool, sharpened like a dagger. Her father and brother saw her charm as currency, and from her earliest adolescence, she was dangled as a prize before dukes and princes. Suitors arrived, not because of her smile, but because of the immense political weight behind her hand. For Lucrezia, marriage was not about love, it was about survival, and about empire. At just 13, she was already promised in marriage, not once, not twice, but multiple times, as her father shifted alliances like pieces on a chessboard. Each broken engagement taught her the same lesson. She did not belong to herself. Her destiny was written not in her own heart, but in the ink of treaties, in the whispers of conspiracies, and in the ambitions of men who saw her as a bridge to power. Yet, there was resilience within her. Accounts of her youth described not only beauty, but also wit, a quickness of mind that allowed her to navigate the treacherous waters of papal politics. She learned to smile when she wanted to scream. She learned to flatter when she wanted to betray. She became, even as a teenager, the perfect Borgia, a mask of grace covering a heart trained for survival. And all the while, rumors clung to her like perfume. Even as a young girl, the Roman elite whispered, was she simply an innocent pawn, or was she being groomed for something darker? Tales emerged of secret corridors in the Vatican, of clandestine gatherings where the Borgias dined and plotted. Lucrezia, though barely more than a child, was said to sit quietly at her father's table, listening as treaties were forged and enemies condemned. Some swore they saw her slip away with Cesare into the gardens, whispering like conspirators. Others whispered something even more scandalous, that she was more than a sister to him. Whether truth or slander, such whispers would haunt her name for centuries. But perhaps the most tragic element of her youth was this: she never had the luxury of innocence. While other girls dreamed of romance, Lucrezia's dreams were crafted by ambition and shadow. Her lullabies were the sounds of arguments echoing through Vatican corridors. Her playthings were jewels chosen for political display, and her companions were not friends, but pawns in games she could scarcely understand. By the time she reached 15, Lucrezia Borgia was already a seasoned veteran of dynastic warfare. She had not yet wielded poison, nor orchestrated betrayal, but she had learned the art of performance, the sweet smile, the gentle voice. The obedient daughter. Beneath it all lay a growing strength, a recognition that if she did not learn to master the stage, she would be destroyed by it. Her childhood was not a tale of innocence lost, but of innocence stolen, taken by a family who demanded she embody both purity and power, who demanded she become both angel and serpent. And as she stepped into adolescence, the world of the Renaissance was ready for her, ready to either adore her as a jewel or condemn her as a monster. By the time Lucrezia Borgia entered her late teens, Rome had become her stage, and she its most dazzling, yet most feared, performer. Her childhood had prepared her well. She was no longer merely a pawn. She was becoming a weapon, an embodiment of her family's ambitions, sharpened by beauty, wit, and the heavy weight of the Borgia name. At just 17, her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was sealed, not out of love, but out of her father's relentless pursuit of political advantage. Giovanni, Lord of Pesaro, was a man twice her age, a convenient tie to one of Italy's most powerful families. The union was celebrated with lavish banquets in Rome, golden tapestries draped across palaces, and choirs echoing through the Vatican halls. To the outside world, Lucrezia was a radiant bride, a vision of grace, her golden hair shimmering beneath jeweled veils. But within the walls of her chamber, the story was different. Giovanni saw her as a prize, a symbol of papal power, while Lucrezia endured the reality of a marriage built not on affection, but on calculation. And soon, the calculation shifted. Rodrigo Borgia, now Pope Alexander VI, decided that the Sforzas were no longer useful. Giovanni's alliance was disposable, and so was the marriage. But divorcing a pope's daughter required a reason, a scandal. So whispers began. Giovanni was accused of impotence, humiliated before courts and cardinals. He lashed out, claiming instead that Lucrezia was corrupted, that she was tangled in unspeakable relations with her own father and brother. The accusation shocked Rome, and yet, in a way, it also defined her. From that moment on, Lucrezia's fame would never be pure. It would always be stained by suspicion, scandal, and myth. The annulment was granted. Giovanni was cast aside, disgraced and broken. Lucrezia, however, emerged untouched, radiant as ever, her reputation twisted but her power increasing. Rome had begun to whisper her name, not just in scandal, but in awe. She was the Borgia daughter, who survived humiliation and emerged stronger, more dangerous, more untouchable. Not long after, another marriage was arranged, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, the young Duke of Bisegli, cousin to the King of Naples. Unlike Giovanni, Alfonso was handsome, youthful, and by many accounts genuinely affectionate. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Lucrezia might experience true happiness. Their union was celebrated with fireworks, tournaments, and triumphal parades. The people of Rome looked upon her with envy. The dazzling daughter of the Pope, adored by her charming husband, but happiness in the Borgia family was never permitted to last. Cesare, ever ambitious, grew jealous of Alfonso's influence. Alfonso was tied to Naples, an enemy of Cesare's French ambitions. whispers grew into plots. One evening, Alfonso was brutally attacked by assassins on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Though gravely wounded, he lingered in agony for weeks. Lucrezia, devoted and desperate, nursed him at his bedside, her golden hair spilling across his bloodied sheets as she begged the heavens to spare him. For a time, it seemed her prayers were answered, until one night, when Alfonso was strangled in his bed, smothered by Cesare's men, the tragedy transformed Lucrezia's fame into legend. Rome pitied her, yet also feared her. Was she the grieving widow, powerless against her brother's cruelty? Or was she complicit, a silent accomplice in the murder of her own husband? No one could be sure, and that uncertainty was more powerful than the truth. The aftermath. Lucrezia's reputation soared beyond Rome. She became a figure of fascination across Italy and beyond. In Florence, poets whispered her name in verses both adoring and venomous. In France, ambassadors wrote letters marveling at her beauty, describing her as an angel with a dagger in her sleeve. In England, she was spoken of with horror, a femme fatale wrapped in silk and sin. The Borgias, sensing the magnetic power of her image, used her fame like a weapon. She was sent to Ferrara for her third marriage, to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Este dynasty. This was no mere alliance. It was a coronation of her legend. The Este court had resisted the Borgias for years, yet now, their future duchess arrived not as a pawn, but as a woman cloaked in both tragedy and allure. When Lucrezia entered Ferrara, she was received with a mix of suspicion and awe. Crowds lined the streets, craning to glimpse the infamous daughter of the Pope. Some spat curses, others whispered blessings, but all could not take their eyes off her. Her carriage rolled through the gates like a queen ascending her throne. She carried with her the scent of scandal, the aura of survival, and the haunting beauty that had captivated Rome. In Ferrara, her fame only deepened. She became a patron of the arts, surrounding herself with poets, musicians, and scholars. Her court glittered with refinement, yet beneath the surface lingered the same whispers. Was her wine poisoned? Were her smiles hiding daggers? Did she, as some claimed, keep a ring filled with hidden venom to dispatch her enemies with a single drop? Whether true or not, such rumors only magnified her fame. Lucrezia Borgia had become something more than a woman. She was a myth, a living embodiment of the Renaissance's darkest fascinations: beauty, power, poison, and betrayal. And through it all, she smiled. She danced at masquerades, her golden hair glinting in torchlight, her laughter echoing through gilded halls. She composed letters to kings and queens, weaving charm with political cunning. She cradled her children, whispered prayers, and adorned chapels with art. But to the world beyond, she was not simply a duchess. She was Lucrezia Borgia, the most dangerous woman in Italy, a woman whose fame was built on both beauty and blood. By the time Lucrezia Borgia had settled into her role as Duchess of Ferrara, the shadow that clung to her name had grown longer, darker, and far more sinister. If her rise had been a performance of beauty and tragedy, her downfall was a theater of poison, intrigue, and whispered sins. Ferrara, with its shimmering palaces and refined courts, should have been her sanctuary, yet it became her prison of rumor. Every banquet she attended, every goblet she lifted, every letter she sealed with wax carried an aura of menace. For the people, she was no longer just a duchess. She was the Venus of death, the woman whose touch could enchant or annihilate. The most persistent whispers were of poison. Chroniclers and rivals alike accused her of keeping a deadly ring, a gold band with a hidden compartment filled with venom. They claimed she could merely brush a man's lips or lace his wine with a touch, and within hours he would be writhing in agony, dead by dawn. Whether this was truth or invention hardly mattered. In a world already intoxicated by scandal, Lucrezia's myth grew stronger with every tale. A rival died mysteriously? It was Lucrezia. A courtier collapsed after a feast? It was Lucrezia. In the collective imagination of Europe, her beauty and her alleged venom were inseparable. And yet, the irony is that much of Lucrezia's so-called dark side was not her doing, but the design of men. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother Cesare used her as their emissary, their weapon, their mask. Marriages arranged, alliances broken, blood spilled, always with her at the center. When their enemies cursed the Borgias, it was often her name, not theirs, that bore the venom. But as time wore on, tragedy followed her like a curse. The death of her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, still haunted her. Rome had never forgotten the image of the young duke strangled in his bed, and rumors swirled that Lucrezia herself had lured him into vulnerability. Even in Ferrara, her new court eyed her with suspicion, as though the ghost of Alfonso still lingered in her wake. Inside the Este Palace, the shadows deepened. Letters discovered centuries later suggest that Lucrezia was not only a victim, but also a player in the darker arts of survival. Some claimed she dabbled in astrology, seeking guidance from the stars. Others whispered that she consulted magicians, desperate to secure power in a court that mistrusted her. And always, behind her, loomed the specter of Cesare, ruthless, relentless, and feared across Italy. To many, Lucrezia and Cesare were two sides of the same coin: beauty and brutality, seduction and slaughter. But what of the stories of incest? those tales so lurid they became legend. Giovanni Sforza's accusations that Lucrezia shared unspeakable relations with her father and brother were repeated endlessly, feeding her downfall. Though no proof ever surfaced, the story stuck like poison in the veins of history. Poets painted her as the forbidden lover, chroniclers as the wicked seductress, and enemies as the corrupter of Holy Rome. Whether true or not, the stain was permanent. Her personal life grew more complicated with each passing year. Though she bore children in Ferrara, many died in infancy, deepening her grief. Others spoke of her affairs, with poets, with courtiers, with knights who risked everything for a glance from the infamous duchess. The truth of these liaisons is as tangled as the myths, but their existence only added to her legend. To some, she was a grieving mother. To others, a dangerous seductress who lured men to ruin. But while her reputation spiraled into darkness, the world around her was collapsing as well. The Borgia dynasty, once feared and untouchable, began to crumble. In 1503, her father, Pope Alexander III, died suddenly, his body swelling grotesquely, blackened by what many claimed was poison. Irony or justice, the whispers said. He had been killed by his own weapon, undone by the very venom he wielded so freely. Cesare, stripped of his father's power, soon followed into ruin. Once the most feared man in Italy, he was hunted, imprisoned, and eventually killed in Spain. For Lucrezia, the fall of her father and brother was both liberation and damnation. Without them, she was no longer a pawn, but she was also left defenseless. Burdened with their sins and their enemies, Ferrara's court tolerated her, admired her grace, and her patronage of the arts, but the rumors never ceased. Even as she tried to reinvent herself as a pious duchess, commissioning chapels and funding poets, the legend of the poisoner lingered. Pilgrims whispered about her in the streets, and noble women avoided her gaze as though her very eyes could curse. Her downfall, however, was not a dramatic public execution, nor a fiery rebellion. It was quieter, more insidious. It was the slow erosion of her health, the weight of grief, the exhaustion of scandal. By her mid-30s, Lucrezia was a woman aged beyond her years. The years of political games, personal tragedies, and whispered rumors had left their mark. Her once radiant face grew pale, her body weakened. Her spirit dimmed. When she gave birth to her last child in 1519, her body could no longer endure. The delivery was difficult, and complications set in. Days later, Lucrezia Borgia, the woman once branded as Italy's most dangerous enchantress, lay dying in her chamber in Ferrara. She was only 39. Her downfall was not a public spectacle like that of Marie Antoinette or Anne Boleyn. It was more haunting. The quiet death of a woman whose life had been consumed by myths and shadows. To the world, she remained the poisoner, the seductress, the Black Widow of the Renaissance. But to those who saw her in her final days, she was fragile, broken, and strangely human. In the end, Lucrezia's downfall was not just her death, but the legacy of scandal that followed her into the grave. She became a cautionary tale, a symbol of beauty corrupted, of power twisted, of a dynasty devoured by its own ambition. And yet, even in her downfall, her legend refused to die. The climax of Lucrezia Borgia's story does not unfold on a battlefield or beneath the guillotine's blade. It unravels in the silence of her chamber, the dim glow of candles flickering over silk sheets, the whispers of courtiers outside her door. And yet, her tragedy is no less cinematic, no less devastating, than the downfall of queens and kings who met a more theatrical end. For Lucrezia, the ultimate cruelty was that her death was not a public act of justice or vengeance, but a private undoing, a slow extinguishing of the fire that had burned so brightly, so dangerously. By 1519, Lucrezia was a woman weighed down by ghosts. Spectre of her father, Pope Alexander VI, whose corrupt papacy had painted her name with infamy, haunted her every step. The memory of her brother Cesare, once a conqueror, now a disgraced corpse on a foreign battlefield, lingered like the shadow of a fallen titan. The dead husbands, the lost children, the accusations of incest and poison, they all pressed down on her, as if history itself were conspiring to grind her into dust. And yet, even in her twilight, there was grandeur. Ferrara, under the patronage of the Este family, became a glittering court of art and poetry, and Lucrezia its luminous center. She was no longer the pawn of the Borgias, but a duchess in her own right, a woman who commissioned chapels, corresponded with poets, and attempted to weave piety into the fabric of her tarnished legend. Some saw her as reborn, a duchess transformed from poisoner to patron saint of Ferrara's cultural life. But beneath the surface of this fragile redemption, the tension simmered. The true climax came with her final pregnancy. Already weakened by years of grief and illness, Lucrezia's body was no longer capable of withstanding the strain. And yet, in 1519, she became pregnant once again. For the court, it was another chance to secure the dynasty. For Lucrezia, it was both hope and doom entwined. She carried the child with a quiet resignation, as though she sensed that fate was tightening its noose. The labor was long, excruciating. Chroniclers wrote of her screams echoing through the stone halls of the Este Palace, of physicians rushing in and out with herbs and instruments, their faces pale with fear, The child, a girl, was delivered, but at a terrible cost. Lucrezia began to hemorrhage. Her body, worn by decades of scandal, stress, and sorrow, could not recover. In those final hours, the dramatic irony was unbearable. The woman accused all her life of dealing in poison was now undone by the most natural, brutal poison of all, her own failing flesh. The courtiers who had once whispered about her toxic ring now whispered prayers, watching as her life drained away. They say her last words were a plea for mercy, not from God, but from her own past. I am not the monster they have made me. Whether she truly spoke these words, or whether history embroidered them for effect, no one can say. But the image endures. Lucrezia, the femme fatale of the Renaissance, stripped of her legends, confronting death as a woman desperate to be remembered not as a poisoner, but as a mother, a duchess, a soul unjustly maligned. Her death scene has the makings of tragedy in the purest sense. Imagine it as if staged for the theater of history. The duchess lying pale against crimson sheets, her golden hair spread like a halo, the courtiers in shadow, whispering prayers and rumors alike. Outside, the bells of Ferrara toll. Inside, the legend of Lucrezia Borgia takes its final breath, but death did not silence her story. On the contrary, it amplified it. The moment her body was laid to rest, the myth began to metastasize. Pamphlets and chronicles spread across Europe, painting her as a sorceress, a poisoner, a seductress, whose sins had dragged even the papacy into infamy. She was compared to Circe, to Medea, to every dark enchantress of antiquity. Her death became the perfect ending to a tale too intoxicating to die with her, and yet, Ferrara mourned. Within its walls, Lucrezia had been more than a myth. She had been a patroness of artists, a builder of chapels, a mother who loved her surviving children with fierce tenderness. The Duke of Ferrara, her husband Alfonso d'Este, grieved sincerely, for though theirs had begun as a marriage of politics, it had grown into something resembling partnership. To him, she was not the poisoner of Rome, but the duchess who had brought brilliance to Ferrara's court. Still, the legend triumphed over the woman. Europe wanted its femme fatale, its black widow of the Renaissance, and it refused to let the truth interfere. Her climax, therefore, was twofold: the physical tragedy of her death, and the eternal entrapment in a legend she could never escape. Perhaps the most chilling irony is this: Lucrezia's life had been scripted for her by men. Her father, her brother, her enemies, even her lovers. But her death sealed the script forever. She had no voice in shaping the legend that followed. She became what others needed her to be: a villain, a temptress, a cautionary tale. And so, Lucrezia Borgia's tragedy is not merely that she died young, in pain, her body broken by childbirth. Her tragedy is that she never truly lived as herself. From cradle to grave, she was a vessel for power, for desire, for scandal. Her climax was the loss of the only thing she might have claimed as her own: her story. History remembered her not as she was, but as it wanted her to be. And that perhaps is the cruelest tragedy of all. Lucrezia Borgia's story did not end with her death in 1519. In some ways, it only began there. When her body was lowered into the crypt at Ferrara, wrapped not in silk gowns, but in the silence of stone, Europe was already rewriting her into myth. The flesh and blood duchess, who had prayed, loved, mourned, and suffered, faded almost immediately. What endured was the legend, the golden-haired enchantress, the siren of the Renaissance, the woman who poured poison into chalices while smiling with angelic innocence. Her legacy was forged, not in the chapels she endowed, or the poets she patronized, but in whispers, the most powerful currency of the Renaissance courts. Her name became shorthand for treachery, seduction, and danger. Playwrights turned her into a villainess. Poets compared her to Circe, to Lilith, to Cleopatra. Even centuries later, Victor Hugo would write of her as a demonic heroine, and Donizetti would immortalize her in opera as a woman whose beauty was indistinguishable from death itself. But if history delights in exaggeration, reflection reveals a more complex truth. The poisoner's ring that she supposedly carried, a hollow ring designed to slip venom into a victim's wine, has never been proven to exist. The incestuous relationship with her brother Cesare, repeated in lurid chronicles, is likely no more than propaganda, a smear invented by political enemies. And yet, these fictions clung to her more fiercely than any reality, because in a world that craved villains, Lucrezia was too perfect to resist. Here lies the paradox of her legacy. She became both prisoner and beneficiary of her legend. The scandal gave her immortality. Countless duchesses and noble women of the Renaissance have been forgotten, their portraits gathering dust in galleries. But Lucrezia, she lives on, not as a shadow on canvas, but as a cultural archetype. The femme fatale who corrupts with a smile, the angel who conceals a dagger in her sleeve, the Madonna turned Medea. Yet perhaps there is something tragic, even unjust, in this survival. For beneath the scandal, there was a woman who sought redemption, who in Ferrara fostered art, nurtured children, and tried, desperately, to carve a life out of the wreckage of her family's sins. Her reflection, if she could speak from beyond her tomb, might not be of poison but of sorrow at having been defined forever by the appetites and ambitions of men, And so Lucrezia Borgia endures as both myth and mirror, a myth crafted by enemies and chroniclers, gilded with scandal and shadow, a mirror reflecting the Renaissance itself, its splendor, its corruption, its insatiable hunger for stories of beauty and betrayal. She's remembered less for who she was than for what she represented, the danger of desire, the corruption of power, the eternal fascination with the woman who smiles as the world burns. In the end, Lucrezia's greatest poison was not in a cup of wine, but in memory itself. History drank it eagerly, and it has never recovered.